Good morning, children, good afternoon, men, and good evening, women, especially since today is the 174th anniversary of the creation of the Constitution of Denmark under a constitutional monarchy. What's funny about that is that this is also the same day, 66 years later, where Denmark would be amending its constitution in 1915 to allow for women's suffrage, so the ability of women to go and vote. Yes, don't be too harsh on Denmark, everyone makes mistakes. Now, on today, we are on our update, on our weekly check on how things have been going in the raid. So we're gonna start from something different, from something weird that we usually leave for last most of the time, this time around, which is something we haven't checked yet. We are towards the end of this reset, and now we are looking at the chance that each of the spec has to die. To die during a pull, whether it's a wipe or whether it's a kill, and also to die before the pull is called. Usually these type of stats count before multiple deaths are happening, before, more than 5 deaths are happening towards the end of the pull, to see how many specs are dying, during the pull, during the attempt. And we are looking at two different things. First, we are looking at all of the players, so all of the specs, regardless of how good they played or how badly they played, and this is the result. You can see a staggering 50% and above for 3 specs. Let's just all laugh at them. What is interesting is that all of these 3 specs, what's actually even more interesting is that all of the top 6 specs are ranged. We have Devastation as the king clown of specs who die the most, together with Balance Druid and Arcane Mage. Funny, you would expect a mage to be a bit more durable, to be a bit more mobile and able to cheat death in multiple ways. Apparently not for arcane mages. To be fair, it's not that Frost and Fire are doing much better in this situation. I would say expectedly enough, Devastation Evokers are clowns who die really a lot. We do have some classics when we go and look at the deaths of specs. We have the classics, for example, of rogues. Rogues being very durable, also, having cheat death, I am told, helps a lot to not die. Surprisingly, Frost DK is quite high. Historically, DK specs have been usually quite tanky in the raid. Frost here is actually above the half of specs by death. All of Paladins, interestingly enough, are actually all very, very defensive. Prot, Holy, and Retribution are all in the bottom. Holy Priest is somewhat bugged when looking at the deaths because of their Spirit of Redemption, because that doesn't count as a death yet. So, if you're wiping, the Spirit is active, doesn't count as a death, and then the boss resets, the Spirit ends out of combat and won't count as an actual death. That's why Holy Priests are so low right here. I thought it was interesting, though, to compare with the top players. So with the players who performed well in the pool, the top 25% of players, to see if we have any differences, if some of the better players of certain specs are able to do better compared to the overall player base. At first, the answer is kind of no. At first, we see more or less the same things. We still see Devastation and Balance and Frost, Arcane and Shadow Priest and Discipline all at the top of the specs who die the most. Of course, they are dying much less compared to all of the player base. They are dying almost half as much compared to all of the player base. There are a few changes here and there, but it is still interesting to look at that despite the players performing better, the result in how likely they are to die does not really change. So, from this point onward, you are completely in the free if you ever want to laugh at some of these specs at the top for being the squishiest, or perhaps being populated by the worst players who tend to make more mistakes and fail more mechanics and end up dying. Now, besides that, let's look at the actual cool things about this week in the raid. Let's start, as usual, from the performance of these specs. So, we left last week and the situation was like this. This was our week 3 of Aberrus. We were very surprised by the sudden rise of Frost Death Knight. But then again, it was just the beginning of the week. There weren't many logs at the top, at the very high end boss kills, like Zskarn and Magmorax, for example, with Frost Death Knight. Now it's been a week. What has changed? What changed is that this apparently wasn't a fluke. Or at the very least not yet, because Frost DK is still at the top. other specs who have been there for quite a while are not surprising. Devastation, Demonology, Shadow Priest, that is more or less expected. Even Elemental recently. Elemental has been rising over time, despite not really being buffed by Blizzard. Now they are one of the better performers overall in the raid, but Frost Decay is now apparently towards the top. It's still worth reminding and still worth pointing out that they still have a few logs for the later bosses in the tier, so that is what might be skewing the DK to be showing off so well in the overall rankings. What is also interesting though is that now apparently Unholy Death Knight was quite jealous of the performance of the Frost Death Knight last week, so they too decided to start doing very well. So now we have two of the DK specs, both of the DPS specs of DK in the top 4 of performance overall in the raid. Who lost out? Who lost out for DK rising so much and even Arcane Mage getting a little bit better compared to last week? Who lost out were the two other Warlock specs. Demo is still here, but Affliction and Destruction have lost quite a bit compared to the last time we checked how things were going in the raid. Now, the reason why it is interesting to look at this now is because a couple of days ago we checked and looked at this. A couple of days ago we looked at the buffs coming for several of the DPS specs, including Fire Mage, which is currently at the absolute bottom, and then Beastmastery Hunter, which is also at the bottom, as well as Feral, and Arms and Assassination. So we basically have all of these specs at the bottom, minus Marksmanship, receiving buffs in just a couple of days. So we will see, given their current bad situation in the raid, if any of these specs will actually end up improving significantly, given the buffs they are about to receive. Most of the situation is not changing either when looking at boss by boss. As mentioned, now we have even more logs on a boss like Magmorax compared to last week, so we can see even more entries to make the numbers even more reliable. Still though, Frost DK is the better performer, even on Magmorax, even on a pure single target fight. They are the best performer by actually quite a bit compared to the rest. And once again, even on Magmorax, Unholy Death Knight improves over last week, and now we have a very, I want to say, a very rare top 2 on single target damage for Magmorax, made up of both DK specs, which is and has been throughout our tiers quite a rare sight, to be honest. You know, we wouldn't be too surprised to see 2 rogue specs at the top, 2 mage specs, or even 2 warlock specs that we have seen in this tier to have 2 warlock specs at the top. But 2 DK specs has been quite the rare sight when it comes to being one of the better ones in the raid. We then have another thing which I predicted and prophesized and now is coming full circle, which is the HPS in the raid. So last week we pointed out how Evoker was essentially going back to where they were in Season 1, which was the top, although not nearly as dominant as they were in Season 1, but still, now the better one. The other part of the prophecy was Resto Shaman, slowly falling down at the bottom. Last time we checked, they were just above Mistweaver and Discipline. Now they are completely and fully down below Discipline and Mistweaver as well, and back down to be the lowest of the healers. I am sure many players, particularly Flavor of the Month, Shaman rerollers, are quite confused about this, because at the end of the day, Shaman hasn't really been nerfed after the last nerfs they received before the release of the season, where they were still super powerful. So they are still wondering what happened. Why are they suddenly doing much less than before? I used to press chain heal and go AFK and do 20% more healing than any other healer. Why is it so poor now? We have talked about this before. That has to do with the tier sets. It has to do with the fact that many of the other healers have been given very powerful tier sets, from Evoker to Resto Druid to Holy Priest, and now even Holy Paladin after their tier set was reworked. They have very powerful tier sets, but Resto Shamans is the worst, is the one that gives them the least amount of healing. So all of the other specs have been able to scale the power of their tier set by a lot more, thanks to the increasing item level that they gained over the weeks, except that for Resto Shaman, the advantages of their tier sets were simply much lower. So over time, they have lost more and more value compared to the rest of the healers. Then again, for Shaman is not that terrible of a situation because they do remain still the #1 pick for Mythic Plus. So if you were playing a healer to try out Mythic Plus, then you're still perfectly fine in playing Restore Shaman. Not to mention, the player base has not caught up with this shift in healers yet when it comes to the raid, because if you look at the popularity, Restore Shaman is still solidly in the top 3. They are actually fighting with Holy Paladin to get into the top 2 of healers. Yes, they are both quite far below Holy Priest. Holy Priest is the absolute #1, but Restoration Shaman is still doing much better in popularity than their current performance shows. Just like Preservation Evoker is doing much worse in popularity compared to their current performance shows. This is something that of course will take a few more weeks to balance, because it's not that if you discover as a shaman that you are now weak, you can suddenly out of nowhere fully reroll to a different spec 2 or 3 weeks into the season. It takes a little bit longer than that. Even though Blizzard has been very generous this season in how easy it is to keep up other characters and gear up other characters, it's still gonna take quite a bit more time to get to see some shifts in the meta when it comes to popularity, when it comes to what players are playing right now. Let's then have an update on how things are going when it comes to bosses, because I still find it extremely hilarious to check every now and then about the situation with Zskarn after the hotfix. You know, look at this. This is how a healthy, balanced boss should look like when it comes to progression. The x-axis is the time, how time passes, and the y-axis is the number of kills. So as you see, as time goes on, we have a rather steady curve going up for Rashok, right? This seems balanced. And then after Zskarn, the curve for Magmorax is more or less the same. Then we have the absolute clown show that is Zskarn, which looks like this. Yes, of course, the dotted line is the hotfix. That is where Blizzard changed the boss, and that's the speed of the kills of Zskarn dramatically lowering down. Which is quite hilarious to see once it's put in a fixture form, to see the actual difference with your own eyes with this change to Zskarn. So this is the current situation for our update, our 4th reset update in the raid. We are closing out with the tier lists given by the results in the raid, by looking at the mythic logs, where you can always see some interesting things. For example, while the healer logs might still make some sense, as we can see here, Evoker has been rising, perhaps not quite yet overall above Druid and Priest, and then Shaman has been falling down overall. That is okay. What is perhaps starting to get more interesting is when you look at the tier by the results of the DPS specs, where you can see things like the range DPS, where, for example, marksmanship still remains A tier, despite the fact that marksmanship is amongst the bottom performer, while Frost Mage, which has been rising, remains quite towards the bottom. If you want to see an even bigger example of this is the melee, because look at where Frost DK is. We just talked about Frost DK being at the top of the results overall, and yet this tier list looks at the logs and says, I don't take the bait, Frost DK is still shit, and they stay at the bottom. Meanwhile, the tier list does believe, and won't take the bait, about Unholy. They actually do believe the growth of Unholy is organic and healthy and true, and it is considered the better performing of the melee DPS specs so far in the raid. So, with this one being our updated situation in what is basically going to be the first month of this raid, we are now leaving each other on this Monday. Whether or not the things are going to change or improve with the hotfix coming very soon for the bottom, basically the bottom 5 performing specs in the raid, I guess what is left is just to wait and see how much of an impact these changes will have. For today, we are leaving each other by first, of course, thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. We are then also following this up by saying that you can still support completely for free, like for example, liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, together with, as usual, following me over on my Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow for our Mythic Plus update for the week. And in the meantime, finally, it was getting way too hot to be early June. So these past 2 to 3 days of cold and rain have been, no pun intended, a breath of fresh air.